Welcome everybody to this important conference. I am honored to be here with you, and let me first extend my gratitude to Professor Ellen McLarney, Professor Mbailo, and Julie Maxwell for their efforts to organize this important conference. We're all most grateful to you and Duke University. For those who have been fasting, we said Eid Mubarak. May this year bring to all of us and our loved ones blessings that surpass those of the past year. As my grandpa would pray in Wolof, may we all be kept where misfortune cannot reach. It gives me a distinct pleasure to open this conference centered on the Handbook of Islam in Africa that we've collectively produced. On behalf of my co-editors, Professor Toyin Falola and Dr. Mustafa Kurfi, I want to take the opportunity to thank all the contributors for their patience, their insights, and the hard work they have put in their chapters to produce this important volume. To begin, I want to start with the words I learned from a wise imam called Serigne Massokhna Lo, who served as the imam of the Mosque of Diourbel in Senegal. In one of my meetings with him, when I inquired about his opinion on the central themes and teachings of Islam that could benefit our world, he said the following in his native tongue of Wolof. Aduna wahaja. Life is about wahaja. The wa stands for wahante, to speak to each other. The kha stands for khamante, to know each other. The ja stands for jerinyante, to be useful to each other. And he added that God could have created human beings as trees or rain, but it is because he intended them to enrich each other that he created them as different ethno-linguistic groups. It is my hope that this two-year conference will allow us to enrich each other and be useful to each other, as Imam Massokhna Lo taught us in his wise words. The numerous publications, conferences, symposia, workshops, and scholarly networks devoted to various aspects of Islam in Africa around the world in the last 2 decades testify to the global interest in African Muslim communities, their histories, traditions, belief systems, organizations, and evolving modes of expression. The recent growing interest on Islam in Africa partly results from the activities of militant groups such as Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and others, and partly from the discovery of the rich African intellectual traditions reflected in the old manuscripts found in the fabled city of Timbuktu in Mali, and the publicity they have received. The current activities of Islamic militant groups in the Sahel that resulted from the killing of the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, and the ongoing discoveries of additional manuscript archives in several parts of Sub-Saharan Africa continue to generate more interest in Islam in Africa globally. The recent academic works highlight the significance and vibrancy of Muslim communities in Africa and abroad, and their enduring embeddedness in the larger global story of Islam. Significant progress has been made on the study of Islam in Africa because some important hurdles that traditionally impeded the field have been seriously challenged, though not completely erased. These include the following hurdles: the usual treatment of the Great Sahara Desert as an unsurmountable barrier that sealed off North Africa from Sub-Saharan Africa. The traditional racial separation of Muslims in Africa between Arabs and Moors who supposedly practice pure Islam or white Islam, or in French, Islam blanc, and blacks who allegedly practice corrupt Islam or Black Islam or Islam noir in French, that the French colonial administrator, Paul Marty, championed. The overemphasis on oral traditions of Africa at the expense of the equally important, rich, multilingual, non-Europhone archives of Africa in Arabic and Ajami, African languages written with the Arabic script. Furthermore, studies on Islam in Africa are still dominated by the Arabic-centered monoglossic ideology of language that values the Arabic language and text over African languages and text in Ajami. Though Arabic has served for centuries as the Latin of Africa for Muslims, to use Professor Henwick's words, many African Muslims live in societies where multilingualism is the norm, and they have authored and will continue to produce multilingual texts of equal value in Arabic and Ajami, depending on their goals and targeted audiences. These African Muslims describe and subscribe to the polyglossic or pluralist ideology of language and believe that God is multilingual and that all languages are equal in their capacity to become vehicles of Islamic and non-Islamic thoughts. They view the function of Arabic and Ajami as complementary rather than mutually exclusive. To do justice to the knowledge systems of these Africans, we must consider the multilingual sources they produce by investing in learning not only Arabic, but also their local languages and developing the cultural and literacy skills necessary to access the insights in their Ajami text. As the rich Ajami archives in Africa demonstrate, if knowledge production about African Muslims and others who live beyond the Arab world and who have rich Ajami traditions is to be greatly enhanced and more accurate and objective, the Ajami materials have to become a full part of the primary sources used to produce knowledge about them. Though the lingering effects of these hurdles are still perceived in the Western media and in studies on Islam in Africa and African studies at large, most scholars in the humanities and social sciences are now recognizing the enduring historical, cultural, educational, intellectual, and religious ties between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. The arbitrariness of the colonial racial classifications of African Muslims, and the wealth of insights covering vast areas of knowledge to be gained when non-Europhone written archives in Arabic, Ajami, and other indigenous scripts such as Mko, Giz, and others are put in conversations with oral and Europhone sources of Africa. Today, Arabic and Ajami sources produced by African Muslims are more readily available to scholars than ever before, thanks to digital technology. African manuscript archives collected during the colonial era and microfilms of African Islamic text collected in the post-colonial era are supplemented with thousands of new digital texts in Arabic and Ajami from Muslim Africa. Thanks to the British Library Endangered Archives program and other institutions such as Boston University and Northwestern University, important Arabic and Ajami archives that reflect the intellectual histories and preoccupations of many African communities, hitherto inaccessible to scholars, are being preserved and made accessible to students and scholars studying Africa around the world. the existing digital collections, preservations and studies of the forms and content of the rich non-Europhone sources of Africa are undeniably enhancing teaching and research on Islam in Africa in the 21st century, fostering emerging fields of scholarly inquiry, such as Ajami studies and what Usman Khan called Timbuktu studies. However, despite the progress made to date on the studies on Islam in Africa, much remains to be learned from the various Muslim communities in Africa. In reality, the longue durée history of Islam in Africa, which started with the arrival of Muslim refugees seeking protection from Al-Najashi, the king of Aksum, in present-day Ethiopia in the 7th century to now, is long and complex. So too are the subsequent multiple adaptations of Islam in the various linguistic, cultural, epistemological, and political ecologies in different parts of Africa. The current research and multilingual textual archives in Arabic and African languages continuously being uncovered show how the faith has traveled and subsequently adapted to different ethno-linguistic, political, and cultural environments in Africa, resulting in Muslim communities where there is no single center of Islam, but multiple centers, where there is no single language of Islam, but multiple languages of Islam, Arabic and local languages, and when there are no single monolithic ummah, but an imagined ummah where ethno-linguistic diversity is often celebrated as a form of divine mercy by local revered leaders and poets. In reality, no book can do justice to the diversity of the trajectories of African Muslim communities, their Islamic traditions and lived experiences. The Islamic faith, sciences, education system, art, worldview have spread across Africa in multiple ways, interacting in the process with local traditions, languages, cultures, political systems, and worldviews in ways that resulted in a variety of societies and communities that are unified by the faith, yet distinct in the way they individually express their Islamic orthodoxy, religiosity, and identity in private and public spaces. The Handbook of Islam in Africa that we collectively produce contributes to the scholarship on the various trajectories and manifestations of Islam in Africa by bringing together 33 chapters that reflect different voices from various disciplines and locations around the world. The international group of scholars who have contributed to the volume consists of established and emerging scholars. They offer diverse perspectives on past and contemporary issues on African Muslim communities. The chapters are written by men and women, Muslim and non-Muslim, outsiders and insiders. All have worked or lived in an African Muslim communities. The chapters are organized thematically in 5, and here I'm just going to give you the synthesis of each section because the authors themselves will talk about the individual chapters. The first part, History and Diffusion, brings together 9 chapters dealing with various aspects of the history and multiple adaptations of Islam in Africa. The themes discussed in this section include the important works and legacies of prominent Muslim scholars, local textual traditions, the formation of African Muslim identities, the different interpretation and implementations of jihad and their consequences, the emancipatory emancipatory role that Islam played to free some oppressed people from the traditional non-Muslim rule and the spatial distribution of the faith in Africa. Part 2, institutions and practices, consists of 5 chapters dealing with Sharia law, female Muslim scholars, Christianity and Islam, Islam and West African religions, and an important Islamic philosophical traditions in Africa. Part 3, Islam and creativity, brings together 5 chapters dealing with Islamic architecture in pre-colonial Africa, Islamic calligraphy and talismans in northern Nigeria, Islam in Europhone African literature, Muslim attitudes toward traditional dance performances in northern Ghana, and Islam in music in Africa. Part 4 contains 5 chapters that explore, among other themes, the image of Black Africans in Arabic sources, African Islamic influences in African American literature, innovative writing systems in selected Muslim communities from the Horn of Africa and West Africa, and manuscript libraries in Sub-Saharan Africa, and the ongoing efforts to preserve them. And the last part, Islam, modernity, and the contemporary world, brings together 8 chapters dealing with Islam and activism, Islam and politics, private Islamic education, Islam and globalization, Islam and the environment, and a framework for researching digital Islam and media, and a concluding paper that wraps up the key insights from the book and opens up new areas of inquiry. So it's really a great honor for me to be given the opportunity to open this important conference. And I would like to introduce now the chair of our first panel and one of the co-editors of the volume, Professor Toyin Falola, that many of you know. Professor Toyin Falola is University Distinguished Professor and Jacob and Francis Sanger Mosika's Chair in the Humanities at the University of Texas at Austin. A Yoruba chief, he has received numerous awards and 12 honorary doctorates. He has written extensively on Islam, on history, and on religion, including religious militancy and self-assertion, Islam and politics in Nigeria, and violence in Nigeria, the crisis of religious, political, and secular ideologies. There is no one that I know who can match Professor in his prolific writing. And so I'm very honored to introduce Professor Falola, or as the Yoruba would say, Oga, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I have a small challenge. I can only recognize 2 people who are here in my panel. If you do recognize them, let me know. There's Zachary, Wright, Amir, Syed. Professor Ngom, can you check through the Zoom?
Let me see.
Whether they're here. So if they're not.
I'm here.
Who is here?
Amir.
Ahmed?
Amir is here, yeah?
No, Amir said I saw him and Zachary, right? Those are the 2 people that I saw.
And Alfa is here. Yeah.
Alfa Diallo, Mamadou, yes.
Yep, Alfa is here. Yeah.
We are 3.
I think those are the ones I see.
Okay, so then let me quickly reorganize by expressing gratitude to Duke University, all our colleagues there for putting this together. We owe you because when you eat a chicken in your friend's house, you are basically eating your chicken since your friend is going to visit you. So we will do the same thing for you in future. We are very, very grateful. And we are very grateful to members of the audience. I've seen the director of Humanities Center at Cape Town University. I've seen Bodude from London, Professor Fallou from New Hampshire. I'm not going to mention our names. I'm just Tracy Fleming from Ghana, just to show you the diversity of people who are here. I don't count in the number, I count in the quality. And this is a very high quality audience. I saw Paul Lovejoy, and I want to use this opportunity to congratulate him. A special edition on Paul Lovejoy, reviewing is over by his students, his colleagues and friends, was released yesterday in African Economic History. Thank you so much from Costa Rica, where you are hiding your face. We are very grateful. Thank you all. We cannot thank you enough. Let me put Professor Fallou back on the spot before I go to my panel. The procedure for my panel is everybody will talk and we'll take questions. But I want to do a very small adjustment in which I will put Fallou back to talk on 3 issues. It's not an exam, so don't worry if you fail. So I want you to comment on 3 fundamental issues. One that I picked from reading, I read the drafts of your Oxford book, 15th, and we talk and talk and talk. I want you to talk about the relevance of the sacrifice of suffering, which Ahmad Bamba formulated to contemporary society. My own take is the extent to which conversation on development and the rapidity of that development has serious implications on this fundamental concept. Because in this concept of sacrifice of suffering, which Ahmad formulated, I think while in prison, in one of his prison bases, lies, to me, a better way of understanding society and responding to intergroup relations at moments of crisis. Second, and you are likely to disagree, this is my own concept. I call it the silence of anger. The silence of anger. I phrased it, I framed this. This is my own coinage. But I based it on reading original texts, including those of the Islamic rebellion in Brazil, that why don't you hide your anger? Why don't you hide your anger when you live in complicated societies? And then respond. Could it be that the implosion in the Sahel, the implosion in Nigeria, Boko Haram, Paul Lovejoy made an argument which has not been pursued, that lineage of Danfodio you see in subsequent rebellion, he was tracking that lineage. And some of them have been blood relations from the 19th century. And data like that says, okay, why don't I conceptualize the silence of anger to understand implosions when they do? Implosions that we see and we analyze as spontaneous when it is not. If I deploy this concept that I'm trying to, and I'm trying to use the benefit of this intelligent team to push forward my ideas. And thirdly, a phenomenon that I began to notice, and I want to phrase it as the relocation of hope. The relocation of hope. In that relocation of hope, my data, I can connect to the previous two. So if you assume chaos, if you assume misgovernance, if you see state decline, if you see state capture, a concept that I'm persuaded to use more recently, because part of what we are dealing with in the South, in Africa, is about state capture. There's a state, but 2 people, 3 people, 5 people capture the state. And as they capture the state, we begin to use kleptocracy and corruption. When you capture the state, what do you want citizens to do? Are they fighting the state, or are they fighting those who capture the state, or are they fighting both? And these are issues that as I begin to reread many Islamic texts, I am pushing the frontiers of my own theoretical paradigms further and further. So could you respond, because you're the keynote speaker here, so you don't have an escape?
You put me on the spot here.
Yeah.
So on the first issue of sacrifice, I think that's the fundamental theme in Sufi traditions. It's tied to the notion of sabr. So sabr, which is often translating as perseverance, is really more than that. Sabr in Islamic traditions means enduring suffering. It means persevering, means struggling to improve oneself. And this suffering is conceptualized as a price to pay for great achievements. And so in the tarbiyah, the Sufi training, the tarbiyah, Sufi ethical and spiritual training, enduring suffering, training the disciples to be able to bear suffering and to, as part of their Jihād nafs, the healing of the sicknesses of their heart, is important in many Sufi traditions. In the Muridiyah, what happened, I think Bamba has emphasized very early on, sabr, and has elevated sabr into a religious obligation. And another aspect related to that suffering that I think is very important, this is where really Sufi traditions have blended very harmoniously with local traditions. Because if you interrogate local languages, Wolof or Mandinka or the local proverbs, you will see, for example, Wolof has ku muñ muñ. If you endure suffering, you will end up smiling. So the notion of suffering as a price to pay for great achievement is already there. And I think what Ahmad Bamba did, and many Sufi scholars have done, is to elevate these local traditions that have counterparts in Islam. And that's really what I call the Ajamization of Islam, right? Because Islam was able to be localized because these Sufi were able to find local values that had counterparts in Islam. And as a result, Islam gave those values a stamp of approval, and in so doing, elevating them into religious obligation. And that's why I think even in the Murid tradition, despite the suffering that Bamba experienced through the French colonial administration, Murids remember those suffering, and they don't resent, they don't get angry, because they believe those were the prices that he had to pay to achieve what he has accomplished. And I think that theme runs through Islamic traditions because they celebrate, for example, the suffering of Abraham, the suffering of Jesus, the suffering of Moses, and they regard all these sufferings as really the ladder through which they rose to prominence. So I think for that reason, the ethical and spiritual suffering is really regarded as a form of spiritual and ethical investment. Okay. And on the second issue, the silence of anger that you touched on, again, same issue. Here what you have is, this is clearly tied to what the Sufi and Muslims would call makarim al-akhlaq. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad is celebrated primarily because of his beautiful virtues. Right? So among those beautiful virtues, anger management is one of them. Okay, and in the Murid tradition, Bamba had also emphasized anger management. And in the early days of Tuba, for example, 1888, 1889, anger management and hunger management, including women. In fact, I was just translating a text yesterday by one of his daughters who said, well, we had plenty of food when we were building Tuba, but he would only give us 3 handfuls of millet a day. As part of their tarbiyah, as part of their training, okay, controlling anger and being able to control hunger were also important in the training of these Sufi, his disciples. And I think, again, that's part of the goal here is to mend them in a way that they reach what they call an Insan al-Kamil, a perfect human, a human who embodies the ethical and spiritual virtues for which God had intended them. And finally, on the issue of relocation of hope, I say because of the notions that suffering isn't necessarily to be retaliated against, because suffering is a pathway to great exploit, that anger has to be controlled, hunger has to be controlled. For all of these reasons, the literature of the Murids, for example, and many Sufi traditions is very hopeful. In fact, I can't find a theme in the extensive Murid sources of a Murid victimhood. There's no theme of a Murid, even the poor Murid thinks tomorrow is going to be his best day, okay? Because of this positive energy and the reinterpretation of suffering, not as something to be complained about, but something that is conceptualized as a price to pay for greater achievements. And I think those are the few things I had on these difficult questions that I think other colleagues might have some points to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful. So we can now go back to my panel. And do we have someone who just joined? Is Karen here? Bala, Saho? Is Bala here?
Bala, I haven't seen him. Karen is not here, but the 3 others are here.
What about Salvaing? Salvaing? Okay. So what I would then do in that case, because originally I wanted to give everyone 15 minutes, I will give them 20 minutes each, which is a way of extending what they say. And I will introduce them, starting with Alfa Diallo, if he doesn't mind. If I'm not confusing him.
I don't mind at all. Please, Oga Falola, please go ahead.
What's the question?
No, please do. You may introduce me. I'm available.
Alfa Diallo, right? You're available.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. An independent scholar, he graduated from Sciences Po in Paris. He studied the history of Futajalon, which is knowledge and data tracing back to family lineages that were famous for traditional knowledge, for their leadership and their scholarship. Its writings over the years have focused on Islamic history, political science in the Senegambia region, and the inner Niger Delta, and is co-edited a book on sources in Futajalon, and at the moment is doing a history for the public, publishing, disseminating articles in media in Guinea. We are honored to have you, and I give you the floor for 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure having the time to share a few thoughts with you and to join you on this intellectual journey you've started. Have been trying to do something that is quite original. I wanted to have a mystery figure that was known by people, I would say people that are not scholars. I wanted this figure to be able to reflect to some of the debates and historiographical discussions that have taken place in the last 5 decades. And I wanted to combine some of the discussions we currently have on issues like leadership, diaspora, or mobility. And this is how I came with this idea of revisiting the perception scholars have had from an Islamic figure named Al-Ḥājj Salim Suwari. So I think first of all we have to take into account the situation that took place around the 12th or the 13th century, where more people from an area, a very vast area called the Balad as-Sudan, were exposed to some of their fellow believers in Northern Africa and in the Mashriq and in the Hijaz. So you have these Muslim people who met other Muslims and started exchanging. They exchanged goods, they exchanged ideas, and they actually assigned to each other identities. So you have these people who were called as Sudani going to Mecca, doing the Hajj, and coming back to their countries with this identity of a pilgrim. So one of them was named Al-Ḥājj Salim. He was belonging to what we now call the Soninke ward. So when we talk about Soninke, we have this so-called Empire of Ghana, who appeared around the 9th century and was quite famous until the 12th approximately. So this man is supposed to come back from Mecca, and people see him with a horse. Well, this is at least how it is he's presented. So you have someone coming back from Mecca on a horse, on a piebald horse, with companions. And he is given a nickname, which is Suwari, which is the name of his horse. So what I've been trying to analyze is how people have decided to come up with a figure that's embodied mobility. You have a man who has a horse, and we have to remember that the Ghana Empire, like many polities in the Sahelian zone, used horses imported from Northern Africa and used actually the mobility and the speed they offered to the warriors. So this man being on a horse means that he belongs to I would say the cavalry, the so-called nobility, but the military nobility. But there he is with this title of Al-Ḥājj, and it adds to this heritage, the Islamic faith. So this is where I started looking at this, and actually what I've started doing is looking at pop culture, because what I define by pop culture, it's all the bands we had after the so-called independences, you know, when artists expressed culture, or African or Malian or Guinean or Mandinka culture, using a narrative that they revisited. So you have someone like Kuyate Sorikanja singing Suwari, and this the song is actually about this Alhaji Salim Suwari. And you have every decade since, I mean, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, you had so many versions of this song. So when you see, when you hear about Alhaji Salim Suwari, you're not talking about, I would say, Ahmed Baba, with all due respect. You're talking about someone that people not knowing Islam have, I mean, many people not knowing Islam have heard about. And what is it that I want to highlight? It's first of all that this history of Islam is part and parcel of the culture of contemporary Africans. So people will not be able to tell you when it happened, but it's part of their heritage and they refer to it. That's the first point. And the second point is the kind of intellectual mobility I looked to was actually trying to look evidence of this man and his community in sources, in recent sources. And what I was trying to do is from Northern Africa, looking at European sources that have been at times neglected, and looking at sources from the Bilad al-Sudan. And I'll use just a couple of them because time is of the essence, and I think what matters for me is more exchanging than presenting, because I think that most of you have the opportunity to read the paper. But one of the sources was actually by the late Professor Enmike and Fatima Harak, and this is a response to questions raised by a Moroccan
That's an internet problem.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back.
I'm back online.
Yes, yes.
Hello.
Welcome back.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
We hear you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you. So you know what I'll do? I'll actually share a file with Julie right now, so she can share it with some of you. But so I've been I don't know where I stopped. I was trying to look written evidence. Yes, you have this pop stars, I would call them, you know, Salif Keita, Sekou Keita, Kuyate Sorikanja. You have, you know, this thing about Alhaji Salim Suwari, but you can actually look at manuscripts, and some of them are in Northern Africa, others are in Western Africa and Central Africa, and you can actually relate some of them to the evidence that was collected by explorers, so-called explorers, from the 17th century onward. So the first one is actually a response to a student from Ahmed Baba. So we are actually at the end of the 6th century. It's been dated tentatively between 1593 and 1607. And remember, because some of you have read this literature, you had an amazing output of literature on who is Muslim and what does it mean to be Muslim. What I found interesting is actually the challenges that were associated to it. It had an economic interest because the issue was who is actually enslavable or not. The interesting thing is it tells how people were related. So you have someone writing in southern Morocco for Muslim. Know that the best of the Muslims are Suwari and Rami, Fofana, Fadiga, Duhur, Kabasila, etc., etc. So my point is, it was right at the end of the Mali Empire and around the start of the Songhai Empire, people knew that it's not only Qabail of Muslims. People were able to relate to what we call the Jamu, we are the social that are of use within this large Mande/Soninke cultural area. So they were able to go to that very detail and being able to say, okay, in Islam. Let me do a parenthesis. Mrs. Maxwell, have you been able to receive the PowerPoint I shared with you?
Have you emailed it to me or did you WhatsApp it?
Yes, it is.
If you emailed it to me, I have not received it yet. But you can also, you should be able to share your screen if you need to.
Let me move ahead because it will stop the flow. So that's my first. That was my first point.
Should we move on to the next person or call him back at the end when his internet is stable?
That might be a good idea, but I'll let you decide.
Okay, let him call him back during question and answer time.
And Professor Salvaing is with us now. So
yes, I saw him, and Suwari is with us.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So let me introduce Professor Salvaing. So our panel is complete, only missing Karen Barton. So my generosity in allocating more time, I'm on with it, but it may mean Diallo is
I lost the network. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm in Mauritania and we have a very poor connection.
Diallo.
Yes.
Can you close with 2 or 3 sentences so that during question and answer time, you can repeat or you can re-emphasize the points we did not follow due to internet problem. You can make it.
So I'll close. I will 5 sentences. One is actually 3. The first one is about how people define it. And you have one is the quote that is quite famous in the Tariq al-Fatash, which says, there was a city where the kings never entered and no one exercised authority there except the Qadi. It was called a town of God. That's one sentence about, I would say, law being more important than executive power. Another sentence from a Tariq from the 19th century saying that in the city that was created by Alhaji Salim Suwari, there was no supreme authority and there was no temporal chieftaincy. So I would like to highlight this to say that these clerics were very careful about not having a strong executive authority. And the last one is extracted from the Golden Trade. It's a book that was written by an English gentleman in 1623. And it says, howsoever the kings and countries are at wars and up in arms, the one against the other, yet still the Marabout is a privileged person, and many follow his trade or course of traveling without any lets or interruption of either side. So, conclusion, very brief conclusion, and sorry for the logistics issues. You have people seen from outside, from the Maghreb, are as Muslims. Muslims defining what a good authority is, i.e., a very soft one, and Muslims traveling and having a status that keeps them apart from the others by not entering into conflicts and having this mobility as a defining feature. I will stop there, and I'm really sorry for all the troubles that we experience with this connection. Over to you, Chief Falola.
Thank you very much, and we will come back to you. Our next speaker, Banal Salvaing, is very well known for the works he's done in terms of collecting original materials and publishing them on life stories. And those life stories include Muslims over time, those that we characterize as traditional Islamic scholars. But more than that, is also collected life stories from African Muslims who are trained in the European tradition, asking them issues around their cultures in contact with Europeans and European culture. He's retired, he worked for many years in France, and he started as a scholar of Christianity in the Gulf of Guinea before shifting his focus to Islamic societies in the area where our previous speaker also works on. So his writings are very well known of Mali and Guinea. And like Professor Ngom, is translated texts, Arabic and Fula, Ajamic texts from over a period covering 2 centuries. So we are very grateful for his original work, and we are very grateful to the legacy of texts that he has left for us, so that our use and your use of this text will further expand his legacy and contributions to scholarship. Bernard, 20 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I will not need 20 minutes because my chapter, as you know it, is an introductive chapter. So I will not try here to share some conclusions about personal research because in this chapter I had only to present complicated and huge materials in a limited amount of words for my readers. It was the principal challenge. Furthermore, another challenge comes from the fact that I have not a personal knowledge of history of Islam in the whole continent during 1,000 of years. So for my chapter, I must express my debt to works written by other people, particularly the history of the Islam in Africa, edited by Lepsion and Powells. Then I will only present a few ideas concerning this chapter. First, I will point out the impact of some basic geographical and historical elements and the distribution of Islam in Africa. Here I begin by the map of Islam and Christianism in Africa, because it seems to me this map is very interesting for us for two reasons. First, it shows us that Christianity and Islam in Africa are about the same the same size for Christianism and for Islam. That is the first point. It is very important. The second point we show there is that there is a characteristic distribution of Islam and consequently Christianism, and that this distribution is was done by the history and the geography. So first point, the consequence of the trade winds that blow steadily from the northeast to the southwest of the Atlantic coast of Africa. It may seem strange that I begin by that, but it seems to me fundamental. Because before the invention of the caravel in the 15th century, those winds prevented any direct contact between Africa and Europe, Africa and Christian Europe. So the contact could only be with Islamic external world. And consequently, Western and Central Africa could have no connection with the rest of the external world, as I said, except through the Sahara or through the desert. And as this contact with Northern Islamic Africa was made possible by caravans crossing the desert, Islamic influences were to come with commerce rather than with armies. So the advance of Islam was a long-term and diffuse process. And another consequence is the presence of the two great empires at the outlet of the caravan roads, a medieval Sudanese empire and the empire of Bornu. Another point is, and we can now move, or we can, yes, to the second map. Another point is that if we think of the presence of Islam here in the eastern coast of Africa, this point is that the seasonal alternation of moussons and trade winds in the Indian Ocean allowed Arab merchants to reach the eastern coast of the continent at the beginning of the Islamic conquest. So we observe on the eastern coast ancient Islamic civilizations with deep and ancient interrelations with local cultures, as in Swahili civilization. And now we understand easily how and why Islam is present nowadays in this part of Africa. And I could give a third example of geographical, no, not yet, please, yes. Third example of geographical determinism, if I can say it, it is the role of the Nile Valley. You see, if you follow the Nile Valley, that it was another natural route for Islam towards the interior of Africa. And as it was in the antiquity, the case for Christian kingdoms in in Ethiopia, sorry. The second great point I should like to emphasize is that Islamic advance in Africa seems to be a combination of both a long-term history and of a middle or short-term history. For instance, the long-term history being the advance of Islam along with commercial roads, and it lasted 1,000 years. The middle term history process could be the Jihād of the Almoravids, you see in the northwest of Africa, from Algeria and Morocco to what was the Sudanese empires. The middle history, middle term history being third photo, please. Now we can go to the third photo. Yes, you see the third photo. Now the fourth, excuse me. Fourth photo. Yes, you see the second middle term history example being the Jihāds in Islamic states in the 18th and 19th centuries. So we have two sort of processes, but we must keep in mind the interrelation existing between recent and ancient processes. For instance, if we consider the Jihāds in the 19th century, they took as reference, at least some of them, Al-Marili, who was a counselor of the Sunrai Emperor Askia Muhammad 300 centuries before. The third important point is that similarly, we must combine a macro historical approach and a micro historical approach, considering the history of Islam in Africa. For one thing, we observe that Islamization was connected with the building of empires, as well as the Western Sudanese medieval empire and the Bornu, you see in the east, the the Bornu is very strange because it lasted more than 1,000 years. So you can put it in a map about nearly contemporaneous history as this one. And at the same time, it could be in the map of medieval empires, where you see the Sudanese medieval empire. But for another point, we can say that most of Muslims lived far from the towns in small rural areas. It is the classical division between Islam of court, Islam of towns, top-down Islamization, and another as important Islamization, but much less visible, the process of conversion in small areas, and the conversion to as an individual experience. When writing this chapter, I was very sensitive to the explanatory model given by David Sperlin and José Cagabo for the interior of Eastern Africa, as they noted that as Muslims settled to live and farm closer to non-Muslims, the two came to reside so near to each other, indeed often interspersed, that their lives intermingled and they shared the same concerns of daily life. In this way, Islam came to have a direct presence and particularly strong influence among non-Muslim rural peoples. It seems to me, too, that I had to describe in the chapter Islamic education and society, not to have only a collection of facts and events, to avoid this chapter to be a skeleton, and describe Islamic education and society in a more concrete way. And it is why I choose to do it in one passage, as it could not be done all along the chapter. And I choose to do it in the passage about Timbuktu and its region, perhaps because it is the region I know more than the others. As a conclusion, I will say two things. First, we can see that a specific historiography of Islam in Africa does exist now, with a huge amount of publications. And in a way, it is the sense of the actual publication of the book we are launching today. And in the bibliography I had to present, I was compelled to make hard choices. So numerous are the books about the matter. One of those choices was not to mention unpublished dissertations, even if they seem to me to be important, and even if some of them may have been written by persons present here. I regret too not to have been able to give sufficient attention to recent renewals in the history of Islam in Africa. because of the limited number of pages of this chapter. And it leads me to the second point. I would want to show as vivid is actually African Islamic history. And a way of showing it is to emphasize that some of the most important recent renewals in African history and the world are in connection with African Islamic history. Two recent renewals that took place in the fields of archaeology and researches on Ajami and Arabic materials. I think of Paulo de Moraes Farias and Mauro Nobili recent discoveries. Some people will think of other renewals, but the important matter for us is that considerable renewals of African general history were made in and through African Islamic history. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bana. During question and answer time, I will return to your map and see whether, in the light of current political development, those two clusters of maps, old and new, have not been merged. Whether we cannot, that there's a bigger map now that encompasses the West and the East in terms of how politics in the Sahel is shaping up. And your presentation, although referring far back, will allow us to visit issues of implosion, the consequences of the death of Idris in Chad, who had his fingers both in these newer states and the older ones. Some people have described him as the stabilizing agency there. Thank you very much. Professor Wright went to pray because it was sunset in Qatar.
No,
I don't know. You're back now?
Thanks.
Have you finished your prayer? Can we please highlight him if he's back? Oh, welcome. May Allah accept your prayer.
Thank you.
So Zachary combines the part of the credentials of our previous speakers. Like all our previous speakers, he's been a major translator from Arabic text to English. Many of you are familiar with his Jihād of the pen. And Tears from the Flood. So Islam, the religion of light, and so many other works. But in addition to that, he's done important original research of his own. And at the moment is taking us back to the 18th century intellectuals of North Africa and writing a book that is tentatively titled Islamic Realization and Sainthood. Sainthood in 18th century North Africa. Before then, you may be familiar with his book, Living Knowledge in West Africa and Islam, the Sufi Community of Ibrahim Niasse, which he published in 2015. And again, on the part of the Prophet, a study of Sheikh Tijani. So he's a very prolific figure. And at the moment, he's an associate professor in residence at Northwestern University in Qatar, holding joint appointments in history and religious studies. He trained in the US, he trained in Northwestern. And at Qatar, his classes revolve around Islam in Africa, modern Middle history, African history, Islam in America, and Islamic intellectual history. Thank you so much for joining us. And I will give you 20 minutes. It's a pleasure to have you, Professor Wright. Thank you.
It's my honor to be here. Thank you to Professor Falola, first of all, for chairing this panel. You're a longtime mentor of mine, read your work in graduate school. Also to the dear Professor Ngom, for inviting me in on this project, and Mustafa Kourafi, I appreciated your editorial assistance along the way and for your continued contributions to this field. So, what I wanted to do today, so as you can tell, I wrote this article a few years ago, which is why the bio that was read is a bit outdated. The book called Realizing Islam, the Tijaniya in North Africa in North Africa in the 18th century Muslim world, has been published by UNC Press. I'm now kind of moving back to work on medieval Songhai with a colleague that's already been mentioned here, Moro Nobody, and also Ali Jakite, and we're working on a contracted work under the British Academy to kind of come out with a new translation of the Tarikh ibn Mukhtar, which is the updated name, no longer the Tarikh Khutash. I think it's been definitely proven now that this book actually represents two separate texts. So we're going back to kind of take the two texts apart. And I'm doing a lot of work on kind of thinking about the relationship of scholars in the Songhai Empire to the state, and also what kind of things they're thinking about and writing about. So my article, this article is really a preliminary foray in this field. And can I share my screen? Maybe I'll just share a couple of slides. Let's see if that, can you all see that?
Yes, we can, if you make it
Yeah.
full screen. Perfect. Perfect.
Right. Right. So this is also my nostalgia for the times when we could meet in person. And I gave some preliminary comments here to the Institute of the Study of Islamic Thought in Africa. I always got to give a shout out to my people, Northwestern. Thanks to Rebecca for being here and others. So basically, my key arguments of this text are one, that the story of scholarship remains important, right? And I'm thinking about scholarship on two ways simultaneously, which is, on the one hand, that yes, there's this idea of embodied knowledge. I think for me, really represented by the hadith of the Prophet, فَمَنْ رَآنِي فَقَدْ رَأَى الْحَقِّ, whoever has seen me has seen the truth. And I think it's very instructive that, time and time again, the stories of Islamization in Africa and around the world, in fact, are often reposited with these sort of saintly exemplars that affect the conversion of mass conversions. And I think that's, was still going on in the 20th century with Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, and others. So we see that story in continuous motion, but also scholarship as embodied in people, that people who have made tahqiq, who have actualized their religious knowledge, so that their bodily presences are the exemplars of the scholarly tradition. They are also profoundly participatory mediums, right? And this is why people are rushing to join these communities. And so there's often a much more complicated social history that's involved behind the sort of big man histories that we think we're seeing when we're looking at, Sufi communities in particular. And so I compliment Professor Fallou Ngom and others for thinking about that critically. And so the second argument that I'm making is that these people move around, right? So that oftentimes when we look at Islamic scholarship in the Middle East, of course, we do look at a great amount of mobility, but we're certainly we're certainly thinking about scholars that are more or less tied to certain awqaf or charitable endowments in large urban centers like Cairo, Damascus, Fez, other places. So, but in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's not that political complexity is not there. It certainly is. We have cities, Niamey, with some estimates say the former capital of the Malayan Empire, upwards of 100,000 people. But it was itinerant, right? It was moving around, according to what some scholars say. And so people themselves, in other words, urbanization is a negotiated process. And the scholars themselves might, come into these centers like Timbuktu, they might just as easily leave, right? And so this is why these urban centers rise and fall quite readily, even if they leave behind great troves of manuscripts. But what's really more important is the people that brought the sort of light of knowledge to these cities, and then they subsequently may have moved out into rural areas. And so I think this is an interesting story because it's certainly true that the awqaf system in the Middle East properly did promote the flourishing of Islamic scholarship, but there was also scholars even in the Middle East active in rural areas. And so what happens when Muslim scholars in West Africa in particular are not tied to the awqaf institutions is that modernization cannot now take over the awqaf systems with the same vehemence, and thereby systematically deprive the scholarly class of their recognize his voice. So what's going on then is that the story of Muslim scholars in West Africa, they actually are able to maintain independence vis-a-vis political authorities through the process of modernization and colonial occupation in ways that other scholars elsewhere in the Muslim world are arguably not. And so my third argument is really about the recurring call to not move too quickly beyond the Arabic textual tradition, right? I think we are still in the infancy in our field. Although John Hunwick and many others have done amazing work, even the tradition of Al-Ḥājj Salim Suwari, everybody talks about this amazing tradition, the Suwarian praxis of coexistence, etc. But the major text that Ira Wilkes and others kind of briefly reference, Fath al-Aqfal, where is it? Right? Nobody has ever found this text. So we don't know what this formative, intellectual tradition that spread all over West Africa, the Jihād tradition, was actually saying in their own words. Similarly, Timbuktu, people are talking about, recycling these ideas of the core curriculum. These are important. They describe the shape of scholarly productivity, but they don't give us the voices of scholars in their own words. And so I make an argument in the paper that, nobody would suggest that the tabaqat literature, for example, the literature that describes the scholarly biographies of the Shafi'i school, for example, in Cairo, would substitute for actually reading the works of Imam al-Nawawi or these great Shafi'i scholars. But I think that's what, in ways, that's what we're doing, right? Especially in the medieval period. We're taking the Tariq literature, which is important. I'm working on that myself. But we still have to find the texts and read them and analyze them. And so what I took about half of this chapter to do is to do such a case study, namely for Muhammad al-Tabari, who by many accounts is one of the key foundational scholars of Timbuktu. And significantly, because if we're going to be thinking about these rehashed issues of race, which are always out of place in pre-modern, especially West African context, but by all accounts, this is a Sudani scholar. In other words, he's not from he's the teacher of the Aqid lineage who is described as Vedan, but it was probably from an American context, so obviously wouldn't be much of a difference. So this scholar then has a formative influence over the scholarly production of Timbuktu, and yet his book, Bustan al-Fawaid, Umanafi is, referred to in various places. Nobody seems to have taken up the task of analyzing. It's about 70 pages, very fascinating work. So what I tried to do was take a preliminary analysis of this text just as a demonstration of why it's important to pay attention to scholarly voices. Okay, so scholarly lineages then, as many people have observed, although we point in the direction of the importance of people over place and the importance of these long-term scholarly lineages, there has been no systematic history of Islamic scholarly lineages in West Africa or elsewhere in Africa. I think, the Jahanke has been, especially with Lamin Sena's new publication, is arguably an exception. But there are many other scholarly lineages, and these are very, very fascinating, right? So here's a picture now of Imam Sheikh Tijani Sisi. He's the current Imam of Medina Bai Kaulak, and according to the, a previous version of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world, produced by the Royal Jordanian Institute, he was ranked as high as the 13th most influential Muslim in the world. And so this kind of gives you a sense of his international profile. But what was interesting to me is to sort of trace, and I did years of field research in Senegal and elsewhere, putting oral traditions in dialogue with textual references. And so there's this notion then that the Sisi, Kayamaga, Sisi, they were the kings of Ghana. This is how the Sisi lineage remembers itself today. And there are other textual references in Idrisi and other places that seem to back that up. Idrisi, writing in the 1200s, seems to cite a narration that these people have a reputation of being Shurafa, or descendants of the Prophet. Other narrations say that they came from Yemen originally. And actually, Al-Ḥājj Salim Suwari, according to other narrations, was actually a descendant of Jabe Sise, so was probably carried the last name Sisi as well. So what's interesting then is to see this long-term lineage that was probably, associated with nobility under the Ghana Empire, seems to have converted to Islam sometime in the 11th century, and whether they had actually converted earlier and then converted to a version of Malikism from Ibadite versions that were previously there. So the Mrabatun conquest probably spread Maliki jurisprudence in the Ghana Empire, not Islam itself. Probably the kings were already Muslim at that time. And so the king at that time, takes the capital city, Kumbasale, divides it into two, and lets Muslims live in one section and non-Muslims in another. So you see this kind of earlier version of La ikraha fi din. There's no compulsion in religion that the Suwarian tradition is also associated with. Well, with the rise of the Malayan Empire, it seems that these, how is it that this royal lineage that was previously associated with a competing empire would have been able to maintain its, longevity? And the answer that I think happened, I'm sort of speculating here, is that they transferred their royal authority into scholarly authority, right? And so, and that's also accounts for their dispersal of the, these, not only the Sise, but also others, these, earlier scholarly lineages that were associated with the Soninke, but then, you find that their ethnicity or the linguistic markers are notoriously ambiguous. And that's because, their identities are really as scholars and they shift, right? So right now, so they were Soninke at one point, Mande at another, Wolof at another. So, today the Sisi in Senegal are, they don't speak any other African language unless they learn it. Sheikh Tijani Sisi speaks Hausa and some other, in addition to Arabic, in addition to Wolof, but they no longer speak Mande, even though they're associated, they're remembered as having come from Mali. So they disperse into the Sisi lineage here, disperses into the Salom region, probably, or into Jolof, probably by the 14th or 15th century, into the Salom region, closer to Gambia a bit later. They become, and the Langori Sisi becomes the sort of landholders and resident marabouts that host the Jihād of Mamadou, and in so doing host the families of Al-Ḥājj Abdullah Nias and of also the father of Amadou Bamba, and give them land, and it's through this way that they're participating in the as court clerks with the Jihād of Mamadou. So they're in some, so then they become, you know, invested in the Jihād also, and then they withdraw from the Jihād, right? So basically these lineages, I'm essentially making the argument that they encapsulate these long trajectories and ruptures and continuities of the history of Islam in West Africa. So if we could pay better attention to what they're telling us, I think we can find some interesting conclusions. Right, and so, you know, just to complete the story, with the arrival of these, you know, major Maraboutic communities, what's going on? One of my arguments with my earlier book is that great awliya, or these people that are known as the, you know, the saintly exemplars of their age, like Sheikh Ibrahim Nias, they are actually, yes, they have a new type of sainthood that they're advertising, but they're also advertising this by co-opting and recruiting the previously established scholarly lineages. And the Sise was definitely the preeminent scholarly lineage established in the Saloum region that Al-Ḥājj Abdullah Nias actually recruited even before Sheikh Ibrahim Nias makes his claim to the flood of spiritual gnosis in 1929 or 1930. And so I think it's no accident then that, you know, the father of Sheikh Tijani Sisi, pictured here, Sayyidi Ali Sisi, becomes the Khalifa of Sheikh Ibrahim Nias, becomes the inheritor, and breaks with the tradition of appointing one's son as the spiritual inheritor. And so this you know, discussion is still going on. Who is actually the leader of the community of Sheikh Ibrahim Nias? It seems that, you know, the political affairs are in the hands of the blood descendants of, or the paternal descendants of Sheikh Ibrahim Nias, but the spiritual authority is often thought to be in the hands of the Sise. So I'll skip over that. So I'll skip then right to the an analysis, a very quick overview then of the Bustan al-Fawaid wal Manafi. This is, as I said, is about a 70-page manuscript. I located a copy within, and I thank for others such as Rudolf Ware for helping me locate this text. This was located in the Herskowitz collection in the Northwestern Library. I understand that there are other collections, are other versions in West Africa itself. I have not had a chance to look at those yet. It could be a longer text. There seems to be an unknown number of missing pages after about page 55. But the problem is sort of assembly. In the copy in the Northwestern Library is completely mixed up, and you can see that there's no page and no numbers. So you can basically have to piece it together because every other page has the first word of the next page on it. So you have to piece. I was able to reassemble it, but I found that there are some missing pages towards the end. And so basically what, you know, Muhammad al-Qabri says he's doing here is basically gathering the knowledge, the wisdom, and the fawaid, right? The beneficial bits of knowledge. And here he obviously means esoteric sciences or secrets, you know, talismanic functions, etc. That he has gathered from that people have already been talking about, right? So he's receiving these secrets through oral transmission and through other bits of written evidence. And as I said, this seems to be the earliest extant Arabic production coming out of by a West African scholar in Arabic. It's probably written in about 1460. And I'm not claiming that this particular copy is the original one dating from 1460. It was obviously transcribed probably numerous times. But I am confident of its authenticity based upon internal textual evidence and from what Elias Saad and others have said about it. And nobody has really, called it into question. And I think, one evidence through the field of historical linguistics is that it's spread throughout West Africa. People are quoting it from all different places that testify to its earlier diffusion. So this is a bit of evidence about Muhammad al-Qabri. He's primarily a jurist. The two most famous scholars of Timbuktu during his, of a later generation, Yahya Tadalisi, who is known as the Qutb of his time, and the Aqid lineage, all got their training from him. He comes from Qabara, which is, it's a city that's not far distant from Timbuktu itself. And I think emerging evidence from my analysis of the Tariq Ibn Mukhtar demonstrates that this is a place that's known for its expertise in the esoteric sciences, among other things. It's also known for its expertise in scholarship. And so basically what we're finding then is that, these scholars come from Qabara and they bring the light in some ways. They're some of the first to bring the light of Islamic knowledge into Timbuktu. So he's known as a jurist, and you see the reference here to the Tahdhib of Al-Barazi. And this is basically an analysis or a commentary of the Mudawana of Sahnun. One of the earliest texts in the Tahdhib itself was written in about the 1000s by a Tunisian scholar. So he's giving commentary on this text. And there's no reference to this in the Bustan, but there is a reference to another theological text which predates the Aqidat al-Sughra, or the theological, the doctrinal text of Muhammad al-Sanusi, that really marked Ash'ari orthodoxy in West Africa after the 1500s. So this is actually evidence then that the text dates from before 1500, because he's relying upon a work associated with the Muwahhidun, Ibn Tumart, to teach Ash'ari orthodoxy, kind of associated with Al-Ghazali even. And after around 1500, then this text would be almost completely replaced by the Aqidat al-Sughra of Muhammad al-Sanusi. So this then is evidence that the text for me is authentic. So here you find his citation of this said theological text associated with Ibn Tumart, and he's basically talking about the incomparability of God. I think what's interesting is that he's invoking ideas such as Ma'rifatullah. And I want to make sure I'm not going over time, so please stop me and get excited and lose track of time. He's invoking this idea of gnosis, which kind of the idea of the experiential knowledge of God. He's also he's specifically saying, contrary to what many associate with the Salafis, saying that God has no place, right? He's not sitting on a chair in the sky. He's no place and no time. And so this is kind of marks Ash'ari orthodoxy in West Africa. So this is the beginning pages of the text. Also, he seems to be invoking certain ideas of Sufism, although of course there are no Sufi orders per se in Timbuktu at the time. It seems to be clear that there are ideas associated with Sufism in this text, and these ideas have to do with asceticism. And here you find these very interesting narrations, which actually I've never come across before. Maybe somebody else has and can tell me about their authenticity, or, you know, I'm not saying that they're not authentic, even if we can't find a source, but I don't see them in the sort of so-called canonical collections. And they seem to be thinking about, you know, the idea of withdrawal of the heart from the world in order to become illuminated, right? And he's also referencing in this text, you know, certain awrad, the idea of having a litany, right? An arranged practice of dhikr, whether it's, you know, recitation of different verses of the Quran, saying astaghfirullah, or may God forgive me a certain amount of times. That is also present in the text. But this is largely, you know, after about 10 pages or so of this, talking about theology, talking about what we could call Sufism in a Ghazalian sense. The last 60 pages or so really move to this discussion of Ulum al-Asrar, the Esoteric Sciences, which I think is essentially a healing text. I think what's, you know, fascinating about the text is that it doesn't actually talk about Maliki fiqh at all. And this is, you know, his reputation in the Tarikh literature is really as a jurist. But here you find, you know, so I'm basically suggesting that he already has these texts. He doesn't find the need to write anything more about Maliki fiqh, perhaps, or if he did, we don't have those texts. What he feels the need to write about are the esoteric sciences in order to preserve them and pass them on to next future generations. So these are really healing texts. He's talking about different kind of holistic healing, prayers to heal blindness, to increase milk production for breastfeeding mothers, to heal men who, you know, quwwat al-jama'ah, to give them increased strength and population. Sometimes these prayers call for being mixed with various spices like hot pepper, logically. And there's also lots of prayers for protection from oppressive rulers, and also from black magic and malevolent spirits. And so I didn't really develop this argument too much in the preliminary article, but it's something that I'm thinking about going forward, is I think that this text, especially if you put it in dialogue with various references to the esoteric work that scholars were doing in the Tarikh Ibn Mukhtar and other places, it seems to be that they're in, well, that these texts, like Qabri's texts, give evidence then of a sustained conflict with political authority, right? And not only the prayers for protection against, you know, tyrannical rulers, that's pretty obvious. And there's some evidence, you know, that from the Tariq Ibn Mukhtar, for example, formerly known as Tariq Fatash, whereby, you know, the death of an oppressive ruler over Qabri is explained by the fact that he, you know, knocked one of the scholars down, and the scholar's student got upset and then took a black goat and tied a prayer around its neck and then stabbed it through the in the armpit. And then a year later, or exactly on that date, sometime later, the oppressive governor of Qabri was killed in the exact same place by somebody else, and that's used as an explanation of why this person got killed. In other words, it's the esoteric power of the scholars. I also think that these, you know, to be honest, most of the prayers in here have to do with how to make men strong in sex, or how to, you know, have many children. And I think this can also be read as a sort of competition for people, right? A competition, particularly for women. And there's all sorts of, there's interesting subtext in the Tariq literature about competition for women, about women leaving somebody and going to somebody else. And I think that if we read these texts, like Qabri's text, in dialogue with that Tariq literature, I think we also find a very interesting dynamic going on, that scholars are trying to establish their own community. So I think what breaks out in the Jihāds of a couple hundred years later was something that was already festering by the time of the Moroccan invasion in 1591. And perhaps the Moroccan invasion really just kind of put things on hold of the showdown between what was perceived as a corrupt nobility and the emerging scholarly class that really feels that there are certain injustices being done. And I think that's clear in the Tariqa literature. I think it's clear in texts like Al-Ḥājj. So that's what I can conclude with. Thanks for attention. I hope I didn't speak over.
Thank you, Zachary. The depth and breadth of your contribution, very impressive, raising a lot of questions on how do we read texts, how do various texts speak to one another, and what do they say about society in the long run. I was able to connect some of what you're talking about to the book by our colleague at NYU on what he calls the medieval empire, the book that Princeton published for him. Thank you. Let me move on to Amir Syed, who is joining us from the University of Pittsburgh, where he teaches Islamic history and African history. He attended the University of Michigan, where he undertook their program in anthropology and history, an interdisciplinary program. And his interest, which also drives his publications, are on religious authority. Zachary mentioned religious authority and figures too in his own contribution. Scholarly cultures in those different traditions and various Islamic practices. And he's also studying the 19th century, looking at the scholarship of Ta'al, and he co-authored the book that I mentioned previously, The Jihād of the Pen, focusing on Sufi literature. Amir, thanks for joining us, and please, you have the floor for 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Everyone can hear me? Thank you for that introduction. I'd like to also thank Duke University and the organizers of this conference, and of course the editors of this volume for having invited me. And as Professor Ngom had mentioned, these are 33 chapters, which seems like a monumental task to edit and put together. So they should get special thanks. And also for all of you for taking a part of your Friday to be here. I've spent the last year, like as many of you, teaching over Zoom, but I still don't know how this works properly, but I will share a PowerPoint and get into some of the aspects of my chapter. All right, so the chapter is called Between Jihad and History, Re-conceptualizing the Islamic Revolutions of West Africa. And admittedly, this is not a chapter that's based on original research. Rather, for those of you who are familiar with what are called the Islamic revolutions, there's a great deal of literature on these revolutions. And so what my chapter is doing is it's basically a synthetic piece, drawing on a lot of this literature, trying to highlight the main aspects of these revolutions, but also problematizing that literature and then asking new questions and opening new possibilities for research. So to begin with, one of the things that's important, and this has been mentioned previously by Mamadou and also by Zachary, there's a pre-existing tradition in West Africa where Muslim clerics or scholars are they play the central role in the transmission of Islamic knowledge. And part of this sort of tradition also is that these Muslim scholars, they maintained pious distance from politics and often sort of spatially segregated themselves from centers of political power. Now, this does not mean that they didn't interact with political elites ever, which they did. Often they served as administrators, as advisors, as healers to local ruling elites, but they didn't necessarily wield political power themselves. So the first thing is there's a set of external dynamics and internal conflicts that starts to begin to erode, at least for some Muslim communities, this traditional role of Muslim clerics in relationship to political elites. So one of the first ways to think and conceptualize the Islamic revolutions is fundamentally, so between the 17th and 19th centuries, to be more specific, there's a set of Islamic revolutions. And one way to think about this is that this is sort of the first time in West African history where Muslim clerics come into positions of political power, right? This does not mean the sort of older tradition of segregating from centers of political power completely disappears. It doesn't, and it continues on well until now. But what these revolutions do is they add a new dimension and dynamics to pre-existing practices, and in particular in relationship to politics. So if we look at historical sources, we can locate perhaps this transformation begins with something called the Tubanon Movement, or sometimes called Sharbuba, led by a Saharan scholar named Nasr ad-Din. This is a movement that starts in the Western Sahara in 1673. It's short-lived, but it brings Muslim scholars into positions of power into into some of the polities in eastern, in Senegambia. One of the things that Nasr ad-Din is reported to have said is, God does not allow kings to raid, kill, or enslave their people. He has them, on the contrary, to guard them from their enemies. So this sort of highlights this new sort of ethical and moral concerns in relationship to politics. And this is also the period where you have the transatlantic slave trade starting to emerge. This is changing dynamics and relationships in large parts of West Africa. And then also there's internal transformations happening in this larger region. And so this becomes the way this what Nasr ad-Din says becomes sort of this galvanizing, rallying call, at least in this movement, for scholars to start to take power for themselves. So subsequent to the Tubanon movement, and I wish I had the map that Professor Salvaing had showed earlier, which is much better than this on these revolutions. But after the Tubanon movement, you have several other Islamic revolutions. They're also sometimes referred to as the Fulani Jihāds, indicating sort of the core ethno-linguistic group that leads many of these revolutions. So you have an earlier revolution in Bundu in eastern Senegal in 1690. It's not photographed, it's not in this image. Then you have in Fouta Djallon in 1725, which is in modern day Guinea. You have one in Fouta Toro, northern Senegal. There's something called the Fouta Toro Revolution in 1776. In Sokoto, northern Nigeria, between 1804 to 1809, you have the establishment of the Sokoto Caliphate, or the Sokoto Confederacy, and in Massina, or what is also referred to as the Caliphate of Hamdullahi, in 1818. So one thing that to focus on is that these are revolutions that are happening in different points in time over a wide geographic space, right? So I want you to keep this point in mind as I continue. And then added to this is also the movement by Al-Ḥājj Omar Tall, who was sort of the subject a lot of my current research and also my book project. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. There's other revolutions, and then there's other revolutions that happen after, but the secondary literature mostly focuses on these as sort of constituting the Islamic revolutions. Now, a lot of my chapter discusses sort of the formation, the emergence of these revolutions, and also, as I've mentioned, it's dealing with sort of trying to think about these revolutions in a different way. One of the main sort of things that emerges in the secondary literature is the way the category of jihad is used by scholars in order to understand these movements. Scholars don't normatively interrogate how they're using jihad or trying to explain what they mean by jihad when they approach these movements. And so what ends up happening then is sort of there's this ignoring that jihad is actually a polyvalent concept. It incorporates a range of ideas, discourses, and practices. It's deployed in various different ways. It changes over time, and it's used to legitimate a whole variety of practices and ideas over time. Like one example, for instance, is the way that jihad is conceptualized and used in the imperial projects of the Umayyad and the Abbasid dynasties is very different than the ways that the Ottomans, for instance, would use this concept. So then this creates a problem in how we conceptualize these movements, because by defining jihad in very simplistic terms, all of these movements are jihad movements, it sort of collapses all of these movements as part of a similar or the same phenomena, and also internally linked. They're all sort of linked. And this also creates certain types of linear narratives that places these movements from the past, so these are happening in the 18th and 19th centuries, and unproblematically connects them to present jihadist or Islamist movements, such as, for instance, Boko Haram that's been mentioned. And again, because we're defining them all as jihad movements without specifying and interrogating the category, it becomes easy for the slippage to happen. There's another problem, and this is sort of one of the sort of Orientalist and colonialist legacies in how Islam in Africa is studied or conceptualized, which of course has started to change, and this volume also contributes to that change, is that reform, the idea here is that Islam in Africa, or the practices of Islam in Africa, African Muslim practices of Islam, are by default heterodox. And then so these movements are all about creating the sense of orthodoxy. And so there's this conflation also between reform from heterodox syncretic practices, or alleged heterodox and syncretic practices, to orthodoxy is always necessitated by jihad. And so this presents certain types of teleological narratives, right? That these are all jihad movements, and Muslims, in order to attain orthodoxy, engage in jihad. And therefore what's missing then is sort of the ambiguities and contradictions within these movements themselves, and other possibilities of interpretations sort of beyond just categorizing them as jihad movements. And also an over-deterministic sort of emphasis and focus on jihad masks other expressions of Islam and reform and contestation over what constitutes orthodox practice. And again, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, in the sense that there's an older tradition of Muslim scholars maintaining pious distance from political elites, etc. And that continues on. And they're equally sort of creating practices or thinking about orthodoxy. So to continue on, then my chapter is basically saying that we have this sort of problematic that exists. How can we work our way out of it and ask new questions or think differently about this sort of pivotal period in West African history? And again, if you see these movements, they're over a wide sort of space. They have a great deal of social and political and economic impact. So rather than thinking about them in terms of just coherency and connection with one another, it's important also to emphasize and highlight differences between these movements. So the protagonists of all of these movements are responding to different social, economic, and political contexts, and they're also trying to accomplish different things. And they also had different state structures, right? So for instance, Masina, or the Caliphate of Hamdullahi, was a centralized state, while Sokoto was a confederacy, creating alliances with different groups and much more diffused. They also unfolded differently over space and time. So for instance, Bundu becomes what is sometimes referred to as a pragmatic state. It adapts to changing circumstances and maintains a strong relationship with the French. When we look at Fouta Djallon, for instance, there develops a system where there's sort of two different lineages and families that alternate power. There's instances of civil war within this polity. And then also it adapts to changing circumstances over time and exists well into the colonial period. If we look at Sokoto, for instance, Sokoto witnesses a succession crisis. There's also different rivalries that emerge within it. Basically, the simple point is that conceptualizing these states simply as static jihad states doesn't capture this complexity, right? So there's a great deal going on within these states that we need to be attentive to. So then one could argue, of course, and you can push back against what I'm saying, is that the leaders of many of these movements do evoke the concept of jihad. They are conceptualizing what they're doing as a jihad. And they're certainly using explicit references to the Islamic legal tradition to frame their actions as those that were religiously sanctioned. But I think this is one of the key important points that is not just important for understanding these movements, but generally any movement that we refer to as jihadist, is that, and this is from page 97 of the chapter, is that the similarity in language and concepts, so the focus just on discourse, should not be an indication of the sameness in practice, motivations, and outcomes. So it's important to keep one eye to the language, the discourse, the sort of legal maneuvering, usage of the Islamic legal tradition, but also keep another eye open and be on the ground to historical context. So it's also important, I just mentioned that these states are different in sort of how they form, there's internal differences within them. So it's important to explore how the protagonists of these different states constructed their authority. How did they legitimize and justify their actions in response, again, to their unique historical context? This comes back to a point I just mentioned. These movements changed over time, and they're also internally contested as they unfolded. We can't imagine that everyone that belongs to these various movements has the same intentions, right? They're incorporating a wide variety of different ethno-linguistic groups, a wide variety of social, intellectual, and political cultures, and various people join these movements for various reasons. So it's important to keep that also in mind. At the same time, these movements are externally contested, right? It's not as though these movements appear and everyone is in agreement about them. They're externally contested by other Muslim scholarly communities. And so this again is important because this sort of indicates local variations and different sort of debates and contestations over Islamic practices that are important to be attentive about. And so one of the main takeaways is, as I mentioned, this is sort of a way to reconceptualize, rethink these movements in order to ask or demand new scholarship or new work be produced on them. So one of the key takeaways, of course, is as while religious language mattered, meaning the language of jihad, Islamic legal tradition, I'm not saying this doesn't matter, of course it matters, but we also need to focus on historical context, the local politics of these various different regions, ethnic differences that lead to conflicts, socioeconomic concerns. Often these socioeconomic concerns are tied to land use, right? Grazing grounds, agricultural production. That is also important to take into consideration. So by focusing on difference, by just not focusing on that fact that these are jihad movements and simplifying them, but actually thinking about them, about their differences, as well as analyzing internally produced Arabic and Ajami sources. There's a plethora of sources that are produced from these movements, both as they're unfolding, but also after. We can start to begin to ask new questions about how these movements emerge, questions about authority, questions about legitimacy within the space of pre-colonial West Africa. And so finally, I mean, one of the things that this chapter is sort of asking for is advance new interpretations and also advance more complex understandings of these movements and their consequences, both at the time, but also over the next several decades, and also for the present, and how we sort of think and understand them. And with that, I will conclude.
Thank you very much. We're very grateful. And during the question and answer time, you have provided us with the opportunity to link that past to what is going on now in Mali, most especially. We're very grateful. We have two more speakers, but is Karen Barton here by chance?
No, she's not. She told me she's
Okay.
not going to be able to make it.
Okay, so let's go to our final, but not the least speaker, our good friend, Bala Saho, whom I've known for some time. I'm familiar with his scholarship, including his revised PhD thesis. He took his PhD from Michigan State, and thereafter move on to his current position. And he revised his book, which Michigan State University published for him in 2018, on what he calls the contours of change, Muslim courts, women, and Islamic society in the Gambia. He works on issues around land, around women in the formation of colonial Gambia. He works on the intersectionality between law and gender. And he sent to me a proposal of his new book on land, Islam, and politics. Thanks so much for joining us. And you can now begin your presentation for 20 minutes. Thank you, Bala.
Oh, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm also very happy to join all the erudite scholars in the field to discuss the influence of Islam in Africa. I also want to thank the organizers for this wonderful work. Well, the spread of the history of the spread of Islam in West Africa, I think, is well known because from the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, we know that the Arab traders and travelers and then African clerics began to spread the religion along the Saharan trade routes and the coastal shores of Africa, from where it spread gradually into the interior of the continent. Pivotal is the pivotal role of trade and war that provided the religion essential ingredients for its development. Scholars recognize the spread of Islam through the trade across the Sahara, carried by the nomad Berbers. Muslim traders from North Africa established commercial contacts with Sudanic kingdoms already in the 10th century. Also important here were the Hausa traders, who were also central to the trade across the Sahara during these periods by creating what Cohen characterizes as Hausa trading diaspora. That required the mobilization of a variety of types of social relationships, the utilization of different kinds of myths, beliefs, norms, values, and motives, and the employment of various types of pressure and of sanctions, among which being Muslim and using the Hausa language as lingua franca were requirements among the business community. Also important to the peaceful diffusion of Islam were the beliefs and values associated with the religion and the recognition of physical and spiritual authority which spiritual leaders control. The dispersion of Muslims and the use of Muslim clerics in the courts of kings and the support of Muslim clerics in providing supernatural aid, and salvaging things brought about the proliferation and Islamization of many West African kingdoms and peoples. We also know that studying the Quran, the teaching of Arabic language, and practicing the ways and manners of the life of a Muslim was also very important in the spread. In this way, Muslim centers of education and learning proliferated throughout the region. Learning was mainly done at the Islamic schools, in the compounds of the scholars, and their students would come from the vicinity and nearby villages and even from distant places. This manner of transmission is done mainly by heart, memorizing the Quran at elementary schools, and where Arabic scripts are written and verses were written on wooden slates. Students sat on the ground. We know all of these things all day and around fires at night. And there are so many examples that scholars have given of these kinds of, or these ways of learning the Quran. So through these ways, Islam became attractive to many as it provided both a community and class of educated Africans. Over time, a sharp social distinction began to be drawn between Muslims and non-Muslims because Islam provided a moral code through which Muslims should live their lives, such as what to wear, what to eat, how to marry, how to welcome newborns, and bury the dead. In short, Islamic culture became distinctive, and I think that culture played a huge role in the way Islam really spread. So it can be said that most of the African customs and tradition met with the tenets of Islam, and Africans did not have to totally give up their cultural beliefs and practices to become Muslim. As such, Islam appealed to many Africans because becoming Muslim did not mean totally abandoning a way of life. Also added to these were the peaceful spread of the peaceful spread of Islam considerably increased also through Sufism and the growth of Sufi orders. We know about the Muridia, for example, the Nyasenia and Tijania, and many others, particularly in the present days. So I want to summarize by sort of asking questions rather than just going through and explain these things that already has been said. For example, how do local conflicts help or complicate the spread of Islam? With reference to what is happening today in Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and so many other places around West Africa these days. Also, I want to ask how, for example, in contemporary times, or even earlier on, how do singing songs of praises of grand marabouts or recount of divine deeds help spread of Islam? For example, I'm thinking about whenever you listen to songs from West Africa, they have interject Islam into these, and others will see these as bid'ah, right? But in this way, ordinary people or local people can get a lot of information about Islam through these songs. The other thing is, how do social media facilitate the spread? Particularly, we know now with WhatsApp and all these things, people record things, all these preachings all around West Africa and send it all over the world in few seconds. So how do these things, and to what extent, for example, do governments also help in the spread? For example, by building of Islamic institutions, for example. And lastly, I want to also ask, how do gender, particularly how women contributed to the spread? I'm thinking about even from homes, right? How do mothers help in in teaching their children about all these Islamic practices and how eventually does that sort of help in the spread of Islam around the communities and villages. And the other thing is, for example, how can we sort of complicate sort of the practical and intellectual challenges of the spread of Islam in West Africa these days? Yeah, I think, so sort of, I really want to boil down to the sort of this simultaneous adaptation and adoption that went hand in hand with the establishment of Islamic institutions, centers of learning, and many other avenues of the way Islam spread. Because Islamic education is encouraged at all levels, as a person cannot, as I said, become a Muslim if he or she does not acquire basic knowledge of Islam. And as such, a local clerical class has emerged with skills in the knowledge of the Quran, that was welcomed into communities for the different services that they provide. And these services range from, as I said, teaching, prayers, and medicines, which included the making of amulets to be worn around the body for those in need. And we must remember that these things are very important, particularly with all of the violence that is going on around West Africa these days. All right, I will briefly end here. And thank you so much for your attention.
I'm very grateful for your contribution. I was looking at my own Austin time, thinking that we have 1.5 hours, forgetting that you are 1 hour ahead of me, and all what we have left is 36 minutes. And we can crave the indulgence of the organizers to stretch our time. Well, now question and answer time, but before we do that, these papers are united by 4 issues. The first is around the issue of test, in which they pointed to the relevance of translation and how this text embody various ideas. And they located these texts in what we characterize as pre-colonial, with a few dealing with contemporary collection. Then we have the second body of ideas revolving around the spread of the religion. The last speaker, connecting it back to the older linkage between trade from other places and spread in association with the Jihad movement. Some people have argued that maybe we've exaggerated the impact of the Jihad in the spread of Islam. That argument has been there. And that maybe it was the European colonial forces, not the Jihad, that actually converted Islam into a mass religion. Then you have issues around translation. And behind them, the last speaker's back are 2 symbols, the mask. If you notice it, the cowries in a leather string. They are important to notice them because those cowries, I've seen people wear them, represent the localization of their religion. You are looking at your own house. But the mask is problematic in the sense that there are traditions, especially in that of the caliphate, the Fodio, who rejected that notion of the mask. So we have eclecticism in terms of how these papers are structured and how they struggle with issues of domestication. Fallou's argument has actually been, I don't think it has made it to the textbook, because Ngom, Professor Ngom's argument is that what happened in case of the Murud, I mean, I hope I'm representing his argument very well, is that Wolof culture forms a template on which Islam is grafted. So in which the imagination of Wolof's life and society, Ahmad Bamba, centralized them and grafted Islam into it. So I could see the opposite in some other locations in which they were domesticating Islam and seeing the extent to which it could work. All the papers gesture to issues of scholars, of course, but one in particular, I think is one of you made the argument that studying Islam is about studying Islamic scholars. Is it Zachary that made that argument? I think it's yes, and it's a very fascinating argument, which I think I will invite him to develop further. And all of you tied your paper to Sufi. And if you throw in Nigeria there, and one of the members in the audience just released his book on Sufi and Ifa, Professor Ogunaike. So maybe we may have to also say in places like Senegal and Gambia, where the Murids are we not, when we throw in the Murids, should we not be more cautious in lumping everything together as Sufism? And see the extent to which, for instance, in Murid's application of the Sufi, they were throwing away Arabism. And in recent inaugural of Oladoshu at Ibadan, which I reflected upon, which I also posted in Research Africa, because as I'm closing my career, I'm doing all these popularizers, connecting more with the general public, differently from my colleagues that we do. As to specific issues, I hope that we should give Professor Diallo 2 minutes because he lost 2 minutes. The question I want to ask him, whom should we be speaking to, given the density of these papers and their highly specialized nature? At what point in time do we begin to speak to religious leadership and the millions of their followers? Should we be speaking more? Should we be having dialogue with ourselves? If we vacate that space, that popular space, because as we dialogue more with ourselves, one may argue we are vacating that space. What are the consequences of that vacation? To Bernard, what is the relevance of his presentation to contemporary Sahel implosion? Because they are redrawing that geography. And we are beginning to see the consequences in Niger, in Chad, in Nigeria, in Mali. So if you go to my city, Ibadan now, you are going to find people that Nigerian citizens say they are not members of Nigeria. They're living there in clusters. There are millions of people in Nigeria now without zip code. They are coming from Niger, from Burkina Faso, from Mali. To what extent is this emerging geography? It's always been there. The Fulani moved from Gambia eastwards. It's always been there. But the modern state is not very friendly to this. To Professor Syed, so the moment you covered, Jihad had a positive representation, but they still use the word now, but it has a negative connotation. So whether it's in Mali or Nigeria, the word jihad is like nationalism. It just frightens people. It just frightens them. It frightens people who manage geopolitics. It frightens the Washington, D.C. fighting terrorism. They're just frightened by that word. Is there a way we can say that its meaning in West Africa is different from the militarization of its meaning in Washington, D.C.? And finally, to the last speaker, we have historical record that scholars and imams actually moved from West Africa to North Africa to Darfur. But we don't have writers who explore that northwards migration of local scholars. We know that for a fact that they were going. That traffic is not one-sided. Just as Trimmingham and others a long time ago have been portraying it, is actually dual. And we may use a forum like this to say, universities with resources can actually put PhD students to go to Darfur, to go to North Africa and study West African scholars in those places and the extent to which they've also influenced the arguments. Even as I speak, you're going to find many Tuaregs in Kano, where one of the co-editors come from. If you're in Kano and you want to use other charms and other medicine, you either go to the Tuaregs or you go to the Yoruba. I hope Mustafa will speak to that. The key medicine men now in a city like Kano are either Yoruba or Tuaregs. But in the way we interpret data, so always within that ethnic prism, we miss larger developments. And sometimes we don't capture these larger developments in our narratives. Thank you. So let's take the first set of questions. Fallou, you raise your hand. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question, or put it on the chat and the speakers will follow it. Yes, we have Fallou, we have Ahmed Salisu for now. Fallou, go ahead.
I just wanted to thank very much the presenters. And I have just a few comments and questions for Professor Wright. He touched on an important issue of the shifting identities and how Islamic education has brought families together for generations and has created cosmopolitan and elasticity of ethnicity. The ethnic identifications have shifted, due to mobilities that were tied to Islamic education. I think that's a very important point because I know many colleagues, anthropologists, always emphasize the static nature of ethnicity in Africa and ethnicity as a source of problems, right? But here we see that in the traditions of Islamic learning, especially the advanced level, the peripatetic part that requires mobility of people, has actually brought families together and creating new ethnicities that are hybrid. And I think that's a very important point, showing that ethnicity is actually very flexible, right? And it has been made flexible primarily due to the quest of Islamic education that brought families from North and different parts of Africa together. So I think that's an important argument that needs to be made, and that's borne out in the archives that we have found. Okay. The second point that's related to that is also the issue that he touched on about the content of these texts, right? So it's interesting when you look at the content of the esoteric materials in these texts, right? It's the same content that you find in Ajabi documents, right? So texts about healing, okay? Texts about enhancing men's bravery, as Mustafa Kurfi's collection have shown in northern Nigeria. It's the same content that you find in Wolof, in Hausa, and other places, including in the texts of the enslaved Africans in the Americas. Okay, so I think this opens up new areas of research, right, that allows us to see and study continuities, right, of West African Islamic thoughts beyond Africa, right, and connecting populations of Africans that have been displaced centuries ago. So I look forward to seeing a new transnational, right, area of investigation that looks at these continuities using both Arabic and Ajami texts, and showing that, in fact, these documents are actually complementary rather than mutually exclusive. And finally, on the point that Bala raised, which I think the musical dimension in Islamic traditions is very, very important, right? Because we know from the genesis of the Quran itself, Iqra, Bismillah bika allazi khalaqa, right? The oral dimension of Islam has been very significant. The Quran itself is meant to be recited and chanted, right? And I think that's where we find one of that African context actually offered Islam a very good template, right? Because of its own traditional musical heritage, right? And so two things are important here that I think we might keep an eye on and investigate further, is what I call music-derived pedagogies that result in music-derived literacies, right? Because we know for a fact that through these Sufi songs, right, that were once before the digital space were chanted in local villages, right, they conveyed knowledge, right? And that knowledge was localized through the use of local metaphors in the local languages, right? And local maxims. Sometimes you hear, if you're in the world of context, you're going to be hearing in the poems of Mbaye Jahate and others, they talk about peanut cultivation, right? They talk about, the local ecologies, right? And that's how they were able to localize the faith, right? They take, for example, Sabr, they use the word mun, okay? And in so doing, the teaching of Sufi tradition became something local. It's no longer foreign, right? And because of the knowledge that people acquired, of the beauty of these songs, some actually who did not attend Quranic school memorized these songs and later learned to decipher the script, okay? So what we have here is actually three modes of knowledge acquisition and literacy acquisition: acquisition of knowledge through the Quran, acquisition of knowledge through music, and acquisition of written literacy based on music in this case. Okay, and I think these are areas that really are shared, I suspect, with many Sufi traditions, right? That we might now call transnational digital music-derived literacy, because these spaces and this tradition that used to happen in rural areas, where the Nyasen or the Murids or the Qadriya are singing in the rural villages, right, have now been moved to digital space, right? So now, for example, you can listen to a Murid Qasaid written by Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba or by Jahate, And you can see online the text itself, right, is time aligned with the singing. Right? So what it means is that you can learn actually you can see the text, you can get the information, you can hear it, you can learn the musical chanting, and you can also acquire literacy. Right? So I think these are important areas where music, devotional music, is actually channeling, expanding Islam, right, in new ways, both in terms of conveying knowledge, but triggering actually multi-literacies, because in this case, you can acquire Arabic, classical Arabic, warsh-based, right, by listening to these songs, but you can also acquire the Ajami tradition if it's Wolof or Hausa and all the spaces. So I think there's a really, thank you, Bala, for bringing this important aspect. And it shows that knowledge acquisition and literacy acquisition, has one layer that we have neglected, because we focus mainly on Quranic-based acquisition of knowledge, right? But I think it's important to highlight that the musical aspect is also a new area that deserves investigation, because it enriches and enables us to see how the same traditions that occurred centuries ago have now been displaced in the digital space. So thank you very, very much for that point.
Ahmed Salisu. Ahmed
Okay.
Salisu, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor, for the opportunity. I am really fascinated. I am from law and speaking from Bauchi State University, Nigeria. My question specifically is to Amir Syed, who talks about reconceptualization of jihad. Some of the scholarships that I have read, specifically on Boko Haram, for instance, and Al-Qaeda, seems to suggest similarity in ideology. That is, exclusivist ideology of the groups, and possibly many scholars have looked at these groups as jihadi group, not because of anything, but because of similarity of their exclusivist ideology, which allows them to disagree or think anyone that disagrees with their own understanding of the religion of Islam, then that person is an infidel or is kafir or whatever. So I want to know from Amir Syed, place of exclusivist ideology that seems to connect a lot of these jihadi groups, and which possibly explains why many scholars look at these groups as jihadi groups. I agree with your explanation on the need to reconceptualize the term and taking into account many factors. But what is the place of similarity of ideology of these groups? That is my question. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thanks for joining us all the way from Bauchi.
Yeah.
To remind all of you, we start early tomorrow, 2 hours earlier, 7 o'clock my time, 8 o'clock their time. Please don't get confused. Can I go to Brian Mazie? I apologize if I don't pronounce your name very well.
Oh, you did great. Thank you so much. And thank you for allowing me the question. This was really enriching. I learned a lot. So yeah, just really quickly, I hope it's okay. Those 2 brief questions, one for Professor Syed and one for Professor Wright, both who I met in the past, may or may not remember me. But the one question was regarding, I won't say quite the deep past, but Professor Wright, you mentioned something about the Ibadi, and to an extent you could even say the, not Sufi, but Sufriya, Asufriya, thinking like Sidul Masa, the Ibadis and the substrate of Islam that came before the resurgence of Malikism in West Africa. So I'm just kind of curious to what extent in your work or in any others, we're seeing traces of that or ways in which in manuscript evidence or otherwise, some of the ideologies, ways of interpreting Quran or other traditions that manifest or continues to have some legacies and traditions in West Africa, thinking back to some of the work that I've seen from other scholars. I won't take time on that. And the second question very quickly was for Professor Syed, and this goes back to something I heard, was mentioned just a minute ago about the idea of Quran, like the role of Quran in this process. And so thinking of the Sharbuba War and Imam Yadali's tafsir that came not long after. So the ways in which people are scholars, if we're thinking of what Professor Wright mentioned, how are the ways of interpreting the tradition are changing and shifting based off these revolutionary moments? So it seems like as these revolutions occur, something is changing in the way people are interpreting things. So what are we observing, at least in terms of the change of scholarship in relation to the Quran and other modes of knowledge before these revolutions and after, and how does that manifest? And the last thing I'd say on that point is just thinking about how even in Imam Sheikh Imam Nias's text, can you hear me? Oh, sorry. He references one of these tafsir.
Thank you very much. We have one more person. And if I've not been using your title as doctor or professor, you have to forgive me. It's because I don't know. Because there are academic traditions, as we have in Nigeria, where people want you to use titles for them. So Dr. or Professor Ahmed Salisu, I apologize for calling you Ahmed. No offense intended. Let me now go to the last person. If I say Kai Johnson, don't be offended. If you're an imam or pastor or reverend or doctor or professor.
Thank you, sir. And I'd like to thank everyone with the brilliant presentations that you had. I'm Dr. Carl Johnson from Ramapo College of New Jersey. My question is for just the general group. We all know about the narrative of William Wilberforce being anti-slavery. Do you think we will ever be able to challenge that a bit and let them know? It seems to be generations earlier, we had a pretty strong anti-slavery movement within West Africa, way before. I know there's nuance to that, but do you think we'll be able to ever break through to the general public that the Africans there had an anti-slavery movement themselves?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let us invite back our speakers to do two things: answer the questions and make their closing statements, because we won't have the opportunity to call them back. And I will do it in reverse. I will start with Professor Bala Saho.
Very good.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. I have two comments, and the first is about sort of the role of women in the spread of Islam, because I have seen something quite recently in Senegal, which is really fascinating. But that is how sort of women use social media by sort of introducing certain concepts or practices, and record them like in bits of 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then just, leave these things in the social media. But for example, women would, be talking about a relationship between men and women, but this will be anchored in Islam. I mean, they will be quoting the Quran and Hadith and preaching to other women as a way of how women should relate to their husbands, or husbands should relate to their wives, which I think is quite fascinating, and it's spreading like wildfire these days. The other thing is sort of this anti-slavery movement. I think that really has a huge tradition in West Africa, because I know that, for example, in parts of Gambia, for maybe over 100 or almost 150 years, there's a lot of evidence that during all these sort of Islamic revolutions, so many people who just sort of refused to become, should we say, slaves, would commit mass suicide. And I've seen these things. I've seen oil wells that people entire villages would all the women from these villages would commit suicide by jumping into this well, and men would go and fight. I mean, and I think those are very strong examples of anti-slavery movement. Yeah, thank you.
So Fallou asked you a question about music. He's presenting it as an innovation, which is correct.
Absolutely.
But is it not reproducing the content in written text? So do we see it more as an innovation to spread conversation rather than a content innovation?
I think it's both, really. I think Fallou made an excellent point here, because I think what it does is that it becomes like an everyday speech, So in that way, content-wise, people learn this, whatever is said in this music very quickly, and they sort of consumed it. It's like a consumption of, compare it with consumption of food, for example. But it becomes, so everywhere you go, people will be singing and repeating these things. But as Fallou said, also, it becomes like an educational thing, because people can go back and look at these songs, online or even written, and find a lot of things from the Quran within it. So it helps them to know the Quran, but it also helps them in their everyday lives.
And the woman thing, I follow Lemu, and by the way, I using the Research Africa and some of my other network, I popularized their statements that she puts on YouTube, similar to what you are talking about, relationship,
right,
better sex, and things like that, things that were taboo topics in the past. From your experience in bringing the living room to the public space,
right,
will you characterize it as an insurgency, or are they reproducing patriarchy and subordination? The ongoing crisis in Senegalese politics,
right,
about the presidential candidate,
right,
and the massage. And the candidate said, look, I saw the authorization of my imam to visit the massage parlor, which I find very fascinating. So how will you, when you cumulate the new conversation on women and the new media, in one or two phrases, what will you say? In what are there shifts? Are they reinforcement, or are they shifting the boundaries of patriarchy and using social media for liberation?
Absolutely. I think they are really sort of shifting the boundaries, because they are saying things that would not have been said before. Like they say some kinds of things, well, like a few years ago, if you say that, everybody will be like, oh my God, what are you talking about? Or what is wrong with these women? But now women are using all these public spaces, and discussing all these things, and even in detail. But what is interesting about it now is that they also understand the Quran, right? They understand the Quran and they understand the text. So they can use the Quran as an argument and as basis of their argument, and tell all these men, look, what we are saying is, we are not saying these things out of nowhere. We are basing it on the Quran, and this is what the Quran said. And some of these things are very interesting. If you see them, these women begin by even bringing out this Quranic text out in the public, and then begin their arguments, and which I find quite interesting. And I find it something new in a sense, because it sort of brings out, on the one hand, sort of women's advancement, but also some sort of parity between women preachers and also male preachers. because you know, in West Africa, all we see is hardly you see a female preacher out there in the public, right? But you know, but I think women are really using these spaces of technology to really, if we want to liberate themselves, I think so, particularly in Senegal and parts of the Gambia. I think it's phenomenal.
Thank you very much. You are a very good Muslim. I can read it from your forehead. This is where you touch.
I'm not. I'm not really. I'm trying though, but not. I think it's because of the Ramadan. You know, we just.
Thank you. Amir Syed, is your turn,
so
please?
Skinny, though, you know.
Amir Syed.
Thank you. So I've been asked a bunch of very big questions that aren't easy to untangle. I mean, the first thing I will say is that I'm mainly a historian of the 19th century. And my interest is mainly focusing on this period of the Islamic revolutions and some of the problematic ways in reference to those revolutions that jihad has been sort of applied as the only sort of simplistic explanation. And what that does then is it equates all of these movements as completely the same. And my argument is they're not really the same if we sort of move away from just focusing on questions about jihad. And so I'll speak to a little bit outside of my specialty, which is contemporary, quote unquote, Islamist jihadist movements. So Professor Ahmed, you're absolutely right. I mean, these movements themselves, like Al-Ḥājj or ISIS, they consider themselves jihadist movements, right? They consider themselves as engaging with what they deem as legitimate jihad. But I mean, one of the things I would suggest is, and I do this in the chapter, is that jihad is a polyvalent concept. It means many different things, right? And focusing on sort of taking up arms is one expression of jihad. And then the other thing is that we need to be careful with ideology, because ideology doesn't exist in some sort of vacuum outside of time and space. Ideology needs to be historicized. It exists within time and space. And so one of the problems is, and I can only speak about West Africa, and I'll make the very simple connection that sometimes the jihad in Sokoto, led by Ousmane Danfodio, seems to be linearly connected to Boko Haram, that somehow one is leading to the other. And that's very problematic. On the one hand, Sokoto exists in a space where you don't have nation states. And so understandings of sovereignty are very different. In contemporary sort of Islamist movements, we need to take into consideration the period of decolonization. The Afghan War of 1979 also sort of solidifies this sort of global expression of jihad. And so what I would say is that I mean, these movements are conceptualizing themselves as jihad, right? And so it's important, if in some senses, to take that at face value, but also be more sort of attentive to what they're actually responding to. In the case of West Africa, for instance, Ansar-ud-Din is not responding to the same set of historical circumstances as Shabab or as Boko Haram, right? Even though they might be using the same type of language. But then if we sort of get seduced by language, then we think they're all just doing the same thing. So that's my only point. In terms of using, Brian, good to see you again, by the way. In terms of using, if I understood your question correctly, is how they're using text or past ideas. One of the things I would say is that, you know, Islamic intellectual tradition is discursive, right? And it produces certain repertoires of knowledge. And one way to think about this is mastering the Islamic intellectual tradition is like language, it's like grammar. And you're able to do new things with grammar, right? Create new articulate speech. And so one of the things is that, so there's a wide variety of text and intellectual practices that Muslim scholars use to reframe and understand their specific context. And so you do see this happening with these, the 19th century sort of Islamic revolutions. I think Fallou had mentioned earlier Abdul Karim al-Maghili. So you have this scholar from the 16th century. We don't really know how his texts circulate, but then they're picked up 300 years later by the leaders of the Sokoto sort of Jihād, right? And they reconceptualize and use these ideas in order to legitimate their specific movement. I don't know if there was any other questions. What sort of Washington thinks about these movements? I'm sort of a poor academic that can't really influence those discussions.
Thank you very much. But how will you respond to one comment that when we use concepts like nation states in framing these movements, to what extent are we right? Would Boko Haram, for instance, see Nigeria within the framework of a nation or a state? Yeah, I'm just asking you.
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that question.
Okay.
What I can say is sort of earlier, if we look at earlier sort of discussions from people like Sayyid Qutb or Abu Ala Maududi, they are working within the nation state framework. Like Sayyid Qutb, for instance, is working within the framework of Egypt, right, as a nation state, and sort of how they reconcile creating quote unquote an Islamic state within sort of the nation state paradigm is an open question. People like Abu Ala Maududi in Pakistan also thinking about creating an Islamic state within the framework of Pakistan as a nation state. But what sort of Boko Haram is attempting to do, I can't really answer that question.
Thank you very much. We are very grateful. So, Professor Zachary, right?
Right. I've also been asked
closing statements.
Yeah, to speak to a lot of different questions. So I know we're over time, but just very briefly, of course, I recognize that the story of Islam in Africa is not only about scholarship. I'm kind of hoping to be purposely provocative, to suggest that the scholars, there's a lot more going on within the scholarly communities. As I wrote in the introduction to the Jihād of the Pen, if you look at actual female participation within these communities, discussions about Islamic law, discussions about metaphysics, they're not just Sufi Maraboutic communities, right? There's lots of other things going on, and we have to kind of take these statements. So one statement, I went to interview Sheikh Abdullah Bah in Bogue, Mauritania at one point, and we were asking about his his ongoing scholarly teaching, what books he was teaching, et cetera. And you could see in his madrasa, he was teaching all the classical curriculum to a great number of students from all over West Africa. And he said, actually, when Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse came, he was like the sun that obscured all the other stars. So I don't teach anything except for Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse. I say, well, clearly what's going on right in front of my eyes is something different, But he, in other words, he was making a particular invocation of this Islamic scholar for a particular purpose. And I think we need to understand what these scholars as participatory mediums, what that means for their followers, and not use it as a way to just sort of dismiss these scholarly communities as once we understand the actual sheikh, then we don't need to understand anything further. So I'm actually arguing for a much more layered and complicated, nuanced understanding of these communities. But of course, but I'm also suggesting that there is, this whole idea, there is no Islam, there's only Islams. Yes and no, right? Of course, people have their alternative interpretations, but there is an Islamic orthodoxy, right? I mean, and that should be in its contextual and its historicized and all these other things, but that needs to be taken seriously. So the question about Ibadi, I was referring to a previously published article that I sent in the chat to the questioner. But yeah, so this would basically mean that these Khawarij articulations of Islam, that, you know, North Africa in the early years had become sort of the, you know, was a sort of periphery of the Muslim world, whereby alternative versions of Islamic orthodoxy would have found solace or refuge, and they came to dominate the trans-Saharan trade routes before Malikism became the Islamic orthodoxy with the Morabatun, roughly in the 11th century in North and West Africa. I would just like to comment quickly about the anti-slavery thing. I think that's really fascinating. But I think we have to kind of move beyond just the fascination with slavery itself. It's clear that the clerical communities have a vibrant discourse about justice. And sometimes slavery, you know, justice can admit of versions of slavery from the perspective of, you know, pre-modern Muslim clerics. But that also means that they're very critical of certain types of slavery, particularly misuses done by the nobility or so-called Arabs coming from the north. And then the last thing about music, I just can't help but think about it, because I think it's much more productive to think about a question of rhythm. And this to me invokes what Suleiman Bashir Jang and others have talked about with the kind of idea of a religious expression that is shared between Islam and African communities, not to make that facile distinction, but there's this idea of transcending the subject-object divide, so that the recitation of a text, right, this is meant to be orally produced and performed, especially poetry, is meant to be set to a rhythm. And we can't really necessarily call that music, but it is the foundation upon which music, then the current musical tradition within African Muslim societies, is arguably based upon. And this is a methodology of transcending the self. This is fana, right, which is very much an Islamic Sufi concept. So those are the things that I wanted to say. Yeah, basically, I'm sort of making a call to not sort of overlook scholarly communities too quickly, and not to overlook the textual production too quickly. But I think you can see that I'm still, you know, what I want to say is that the texts are actually performed, right, and that the scholarly embodiments are actually participatory mediums that represent much more than just the particular identities of these big names that we've heard about.
Thank you very much. We are very grateful. And let me call Bernard, Professor Salvaing, to make his closing statements and respond to questions. Is it there? Has it left?
He's there. He's mute. Yeah. Okay, good.
Okay. What was the question?
No, you are making your closing statements and responding to any question they ask you. You may exercise, you may pass if you don't have anything to say.
I could translate. Il veut que vous disiez vos derniers mots et répondre à toute question que vous voudriez. Et cela dépend de vous, tous les derniers mots que vous aviez à dire.
Bon, oui, d'accord. Je croyais que c'était une question spécifique.
Sorry.
Yes. Well, but my last word, I have not anything to add to all the interesting propositions that were made.
Thank you.
Just to say.
Hello, can I say
I was very happy.
If you hear me?
Just to say, I was very happy to write the chapter of this book and to enter your community. That will be my last word.
Thank you very much. And Alfa, is your system working, please? Alfa Diallo, is your system working?
Yes, I'm trying to. Can you hear me now? It's been a
Yes,
nightmare.
please.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so I'll be brief, hoping that colleagues and other friends can listen to me. My response to your question regarding religious leadership, due to the nature of the community, leadership was only defined through religious terms and concepts. And I think this is where we relate back to the questions on jihad. People using the pens and the concepts they had could not articulate a discourse on public affairs or on leadership without using the vocabulary and the written heritage of Islam. So that's where it comes from. And if you hear, for example, what was said a couple of days ago with the former Sar King Kano being appointed as a representative of the Nyasan Faida, when you get back to that point, you realize that religious leadership is at times far more powerful and far more fluid than the established borders that we've seen during the 19th century and the 20th century. So my point was to actually revisit what sometimes is defined as informal influence or informal power, and to put back this long-term history into perspective and realize that a leadership, whether it is defined as religious or Sufi, it's still a way to explain the word and to rally people to achieve common ventures. So thank you. I hope you were able to listen to what I had to say. And without further ado, I give you the floor back. Thank you.
Thank you. It's now my pleasure, as well as a privilege, to invite our sponsors to make their closing remark. Please. I
got an email from a professor, for Professor Ngom, and with a question that said, how does music-derived literacy apply to contemporary modes of knowledge production and acquisition through digital and social platforms? I put the question in the chat as well, and that was for Professor Ngom.
That's a good point. Good question. I think that's an area that deserves to be investigated. My own experience is that what was once happening in the 1880s and 1890s has now moved to digital space. So in 1888, when Tuba was being founded, Muris were chanting these poems that Bamba wrote, and they were arrested by the French for disturbing the peace. But they did not know that what they were reciting was the qasaids that Shah Ahmad Bamba was teaching, that was part of their tarbiyah, their Sufi ethical training, right? And around the same time, poems by Mbai Jahate, Morkaire, and Samba Jarambai, which were translating Bamba's ideas into the local language in Wolof, in Ajami, were being chanted and disseminated in rural areas, right? And so they would go to these villages and they would chant them. And again, they got arrested by the French colonial system as disturbing the peace, because these were regarded as really people who were not Muslim, right? Who were not really Islamized. Again, that concept of Black Islam. But my point is that what they did not know, and I think that's really why the Muridiyya succeeded in expanding, was that actually they were communicating. They were using pedagogies and what I call music-derived pedagogies that Professor Wright expanded on in his study discussions, right? And so what I'm saying is that the same principle, right, the same approach, the same pedagogy that used devotional music, verbalized poetry in Arabic or Ajami, that was conveying knowledge, right? And that later generated actually written forms of literacy, because many of those people who were chanting them were actually adults who did not have the time to go to the Quranic school. I mean, most of the people who first came to Bamba were adults, really, of the most marginalized one. And it is through this poetry that resonated with them because of the metaphors and the Sufi teachings that elevated some of the local virtues they had, like Ngor, Jom, you know, and all of those, that captivated them, that brought them into Islam. And then it's that knowledge later that led them to want to decipher the script, to know Arabic or to know Ajami, right? So what I'm saying now, what has happened with digital media is that the modes are the same, but everything has been moved to digital space. So now, for example, if you just search Sheikh Amadou Bamba Khassaids or Wolofal, you will actually find beautifully put in a multimedia website, the poem, the actual text is there, and it's progressing as people are chanting them. Right? So it's perfectly timeline. And you will see now actually hundreds of thousands of people in the diaspora, right, who are actually visualizing these documents that are timelined with songs and listening to it. And they move slowly by slowly, resulting in both acquisition of knowledge and new forms of literacies. Okay. And I think this is very, very important. And it's a new dimension that I think is not really research, but I think it's very, very important because it has now expanded maybe 100 folds, right? What used to take place in these rural villages, right? By moving them in detailed space, right? And allowing people in the diaspora to actually acquire literacy in Ajami, in Wolof, literacy in Warsh-based Arabic, on which the classical poems of Amadou Bamba are written, right? And also be able to acquire Sufi knowledge, right? So I think to answer in a nutshell, Bamba, I think this is a very good, important area that really shows continuity of pedagogies, you know, and how music is central, right, in that expansion of Islam, but also expansion of multiple forms of literacy, not only Arabic literacy, classical Arabic literacy, but also Ajami literacy. And I think people in your generation who are more tech savvy than I am, have materials, really new materials to investigate these continuities. So thanks for the great question.